to some persons who are probably hearing about Sudan for the first time, can you give us a little breakdown of what is Sudan?
Yeah, so the Sudan, geographically speaking, right, is immediately to the south of Egypt. Um, and in terms of kind of ancient history, the Sudan, had kind of one of the earliest documented civilizations in sub-Saharan Africa, known as, Kush, Maori. And so Sudan was very much kind of a political and economic partner with ancient Egypt, despite the fact that ancient Egypt has really received, most of the scholarly and popular attention. But if we fast forward a few thousand years to the 1800s, Sudan from 1821 until 1885 was essentially a Turkish and Egyptian colony. There was a famous ruler in Egypt in the 18th century, in the 1800s, known as Muhammad Ali, right? The second most famous Muhammad Ali in world history. But this Egyptian ruler in the 1800s basically wanted to use Sudan, for lack of a better term, as a slave colony, right? This enormous region to basically capture slaves to fill his armies. And so the Sudan has, really for about 60 years in the 1800s was a colonial state, right? But in the late 1800s, a particular man, Muhammad Ahmed, claimed to be the Islamic Mahdi, right? This kind of millenarian figure who would bring about freedom from oppression. And so he famously cast out the Turco-Egyptian regime. But in 1898, the Union Jack, right, in the name of kind of, avenging the death of Charles Gordon and bringing, Christianity, commerce, and civilization to Sudan, conquers the Sudan. And so Sudan was, for all intents and purposes, a part of the British Empire from 1898 all the way to independence in 1956. One of my favorite things to do as an Africanist is to push against this notion of Ghana being the first post-colonial sub-Saharan African state, because Ghana becomes independent in 1957, Sudan becomes independent in 1956, right? January 1st, 1956. And so there's a whole reason why people kind of focus on Ghana and not Sudan, but that's a completely different story. But socially or demographically, Sudan, used to be an extremly long country with respect to kind of going from Egypt to the north all the way to Uganda in the south. And so most of northern Sudan's population is of Arab culture and of the Islamic faith. Much of southern Sudan, and by that we're really talking about the lower third of the country, is not Muslim and identifies kind of culturally as Black and African, right? And so when Sudan became independent in 1956, national power was really headquartered in the north. And so there were lots of conflicts between the north and south. Two civil wars were fought between the two regions. And famously, after the second civil war between North and South ends in 2005, it was agreed that South Sudan would have an opportunity to vote, right? Whether to stay in the Sudan or to break off and form their own country. And so that vote was held in 2011. Southerners overwhelmingly voted for secession. I think the number was 98.3%. And so in July of 2011, South Sudan emerged onto the world stage as the world's newest nation, right? So it's kind of a misnomer, right, to say South Sudan is 10 years old because, Sudan, like all parts of the world, has been part of history, for all time, right? So it didn't just kind of emerge out of a vacuum, right? But in terms of being its own internationally recognized nation state, South Sudan is about 10 and a half years old now.
Christianity and political imagination in Southern Sudan. What exactly are we talking about here?
Absolutely. So really what I talk about in my book is the way in which South Sudanese political actors have kind of inserted themselves into the Bible in really interesting ways, right? When I was in Juba, the capital of South Sudan, in 2012, when South Sudan celebrated its first anniversary of independence, I had the chance to attend a ceremony in which there were, several government officials. Former Archbishop Desmond Tutu attended. And so I was really intrigued by the way in which the speakers at this ceremony used biblical language, right? One referred to, the country crossing the proverbial river, right? The president of South Sudan today, Salva Kiir, is colloquially known as a Joshua, right? While SPLA leader John Garang was known as Moses, right? The initial national anthem for South Sudan referred to the country as a land of milk and honey. And many people in the country believed that a prophecy from the book of Isaiah, chapter 18, actually predicted South Sudanese independence. The prophecy from Isaiah 18 refers to the people of Cush, Cush, and the prophecy talks about this people basically going through a time of oppression, but then, God finally delivering them and the people presenting gifts to God on Mount Zion, right? This prophecy was so popular among South Sudanese that Vice President Riek Machar even proposed that a pilgrimage be made to Israel, right, in order to bring this, several thousands-year-old prophecy to fruition. And so in my mind, learning about this, I'm like, I wonder what the longer history of this is, right? And so as an historian, right, it was a joy for me to really dive into the archive and, read private correspondence and colonial newspapers and speeches and things like that. And the argument in my book, right, is that South Sudanese have long seen themselves as a kind of chosen people, right? Chosen in the same vein that the people of Israel in the Bible, right, were known as God's chosen people. And with that chosenness came political consequences. So for people in South Sudan to claim chosenness meant, well, look, we may be on the kind of socio-political margins of Sudanese statecraft, but because we are a chosen people, right, we are, seen by God, we are special in God's sight, and God is going to providentially work out our political liberation from our oppressors, right? And so chosenness in this way comes, not just with the kind of religious component, but a very practical political one as well. And so God was approached not just as, a kind of, unseen, all powerful entity, but really as a political actor, right? Literally working, in South Sudan in terms of, protecting people from harm, right? Protecting people during their flights, to say Congo or Uganda as refugees, right? Um, and something I talk about as well, right, is the fact that lots of times in South Sudanese discourse, those who were chosen were not described as being Arab or Muslim, right? And so implicitly, this idea of chosenness by God was connected to religion and race, right? And so, what are the consequences of saying that God's chosen people are Black, right? How does that kind of affect how people see their state and their role in the state? So that's kind of what the book means by Christianity and political imagination.
Me, I never really knew God was this political. So he go around and start choosing people, those he want to punish or those he want to save. Of course, this fall into the politics of religion quite correctly.